Today, I will be testing 11 different touch-up methods on silver.
Now, let's talk about setting up this test. Unfortunately, my budget didn't allow for me to get 6 silver Lamborghinis with the exact same rock chip on each of them. So I had to revert to my standard testing procedure, which is a metal spray card sprayed exactly like you would paint a car. Then laser etch damage into it for consistent results. Next, I cleaned and sanded each sample. Then I masked off each area to avoid contaminating the samples. For shaving down the clear, you can use a denibbing file or a carbide tool. But honestly, unless you do this every day, they're a complete waste of money when you can just use a very specially prepared razor blade that you can make for 3 cents. I will show you how to make that after we do the testing. For sanding, I will be using the Kovex because I can use it dry. It's also very fast and leaves a smooth finish. But really, any other sandpaper or around the same grit should work fine. You may have to do wet sanding with it. Each test that we sand and buff will all follow the same procedure. 1500 grit, then 2500 grit, then 3000 grit, and then buffed with a 2-inch polisher and Wizard's Misticut. Okay, enough talk. Let's start testing. Test 1. The goal in this test is we want to color the damage. To do this, we will carefully apply the touch-up paint to the damage using a method that I have dubbed the quick touch method. We'll try to keep the paint contained, and we'll let the capillary action of the monkey finger do the work, and fill the chip right up to the edge. The whole trick here is lifting as you go to orient the metallic. We'll let that dry and move on to test 2. Now for test 2. The goal in this test is we want to smear the paint and then remove the excess. So we will add a few drops of paint, we'll smear the paint, we'll let it dry, and then we'll take a flat lint-free cloth and wrap it around a block or an ape edge. We'll add a few drops of the DIY excess remover and then very carefully try to remove the excess paint without pulling paint out of the chip. Now test 3. So we'll add a few drops of paint, we will smear the paint. Now that it's dry to the touch, we will use the monkey wipe to peel the excess paint, leaving a little tiny paint sticker right there in the damage. And best of all, there's no special block, technique, or skill needed. Test 4. The internet's favorite go-to method, the color sand and buff. The most common way I've seen this done is to just fill it with color, let it dry, sand it, and buff it. To do this, we will overfill the chip by pressing on the monkey finger to push out a bubble of paint. We'll let it dry, we'll scrape it flush with our special razor, and then sand and buff. Test 5. This method is similar to the one recommended by Scratch Wizards. The goal is to add putty to the chip, then chemically remove the excess, leaving a divot for the touch-up paint to call home, and hiding the edges of the chips. We'll start by using a spreader or the firm side of the ape edge to spread a neutral color spot filler over the chips. Now we could let this dry and use the DIY excess remover, but today we'll catch it while it's wet and use the monkey wipe. Next, we will color the damage using the quick touch method from test 1. Then we will scrape off any excess paint, and then we'll change the tip on the monkey finger to a smaller gauge. We'll then add the clear, we will let it cure, then scrape it flush with a razor, and then sand and buff. For test 6, there's so many different ways you can do this method. So in this test, we are mixing 50% clear with 50% color. Then we'll add a new tip, we will overfill the chip, we will let it cure, and then we'll scrape it flush with a special razor and then sand and buff. For test 7, I was curious what would happen if you built up layers of paint using the monkey method, then added clear, then done a sand and buff. So I added 6 layers of paint, removing each layer's excess. Then I added clear, then I scraped it flush, and then I done a sand and buff. For test 8, I wanted to test something that it seems like no matter what video you watch or forum you read, somebody always recommends this method. They say you need to add the primer, then you need to color, then you need to clear, and then you need to sand it down and buff it. So to test this out, I added a UV primer, I cured it, I scraped it flush, then I spread the paint with a razor blade, then I scraped away the excess paint with the same razor, then I added UV clear, then I cured it, and then I scraped that flush, and then I did the sand and buff. And that method didn't work at all because there wasn't enough room for the touch-up paint. So clearly I need to sand down the primer to make a divot for the touch-up paint. We'll try that in test 9. So test 9 is a variation on test 8. So what we want to do is try to feather the edges of the chip. And sand them down so they're not so harsh. Then we want to build it back up with primer, sand that down a little bit. Then we want to add some paint, and then clear. So I got to sanding the chips, but the only tool that I could find that was small and flat enough was this 1/8 inch end mill. So I went to the laser cutter and cut some little tiny pieces of sandpaper for it. Then I sanded it down the best I could. I added UV primer, and then I got to sanding again with that little tiny sander. After I felt like I got it low enough for the touch-up paint, I then added paint using the quick touch method. I then added the clear, and then finally I finished it off with a sand and buff. Test 10 is similar to Test 9, but with a few key differences. Anytime you see advice for touch-up paint, there's always somebody that says you need to spray it for it to match. So I wanted to give that a shot. But while I was doing this test, my hand started cramping using that little tiny sander. I went through the same steps, but this time I used the corner of a piece of sandpaper to try to get in there. So to spray it, I figured the best way to spray it was to make a little tiny mask that I could hold up above the surface a little bit, so when I sprayed, the paint would come in and kind of feather out on the edges. So I rolled up some tape and put it around the edges to hold the plastic up just a little bit, and then I got to spraying. Then I added the clear, and I did a sand and buff. And while sanding and buffing, I exposed the primer, so clearly I didn't sand down the primer enough and leave enough room for the touch-up paint. Now finally for Test 11. This test is a mix of Test 5 and 10. We'll add some spot filler, we'll remove the excess, then we'll spray it with our mask, and then just leave it. Let's make that razor. We'll start with a flat surface and some 1500 grit sandpaper. Then you want to drag the razor at about a 45-degree angle away from you with the numbers facing towards you. Make sure you lift each time you drag. Then you want to sand off the edges. That way they're not pointy. And the whole thing about dragging it is you're actually curling over the edge and making a little scoop. Then you want to drag it away from you 10 times again, and then congratulations, you don't have to buy any special tools. Test 1, the quick touch. This method was fast and the results were pretty good compared to the others. This would be my go-to for decent touch-up. Test 2, the DIY excess remover. Now this one wasn't perfect, but it's also not the worst either. If you just want an easy way to get decent touch-up and not have blobs of paint everywhere, this is an easy way to do it. Test 3, the monkey method. Near perfect on the small chip, but you can still see it when you get it in the light just right. I'm sure this is also dependent on the paint as well. I think the larger spots could have benefited from a few more coats. Test 4, the color sand and buff. This is how many experts say to do it, and I bet it would work a lot better on solid colors because this method disturbs the metallics, and in my opinion, the risk of damage to your car outweighs the results. Test 5, the filler color sand and buff. This one surprised me a little bit. It looks like filling the chip before adding the color actually made it look worse than just carefully dabbing paint in there. This method was very time consuming and very risky. Although I'm curious, if I just put clear over method 1 without any filler, would that look any better? Comment down below and let me know if I should try that. Test 6, the clear color mix sand and buff. Not the worst test, but not very good either. Test 7. I actually thought this one turned out a little bit better, but that's why we experiment. Test 8. It seems like adding the primer didn't leave any room for the color or clear, so when I sanded and buffed it, it took away all the color and clear. Test 9 is a little bit better than Test 8, but it's still not that great. Test 10, I ended up sanding down to the primer on the small and medium chip, but if you look at the large chip, you can clearly see that spraying it doesn't make it match any better. Test 11 versus Test 5, they're basically the same method, but Test 11 was sprayed, and honestly, I don't think Test 5 or 11 is even worth doing. Make sure you like, subscribe, and share this video, and we'll see you in the next one.